Процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Израиля. Решение принимается. На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании следующих докладчиков. Заместителя генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства госпожу Розмари Ди Карло и председателя Координационного комитета по передислокации и руководителя миссии Организации Объединенных Наций по поддержке осуществления соглашения по Ходейде генерал-майора Майкла Берри. Решение принимается. Совет Безопасности приступает к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. Сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Розмари Ди Карло.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to brief the Council regarding the recent developments in the Middle East region. On 19 July, an uncrewed aerial vehicle struck a residential building in the populated urban center of Tel Aviv. One Israeli civilian was killed by shrapnel, and 10 Israeli civilians were injured and evacuated to hospitals. A fire broke out at the scene, and damages were caused to buildings and vehicles by the strike's impact. The Houthis in Yemen claimed responsibility for the attack in a statement, saying it was in retaliation for the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. They announced they had launched a new drone called Yafa, and further declared that Tel Aviv would now be a primary target. The Israel Defense Forces stated that its initial assessment identified the UAV as a modified Iranian Samad-3 zone launched from Yemen, and that its forces had intercepted another UAV in the same time frame. The Secretary General condemned the deadly attack. He remains deeply concerned about the risk such dangerous acts pose for further escalation in the region. Since then, however, we have witnessed additional exchanges, making the situation more precarious. On 20 July, Israel carried out multiple airstrikes in and around Hodeidah port in Yemen. The IDF spokesperson characterized strikes as necessary and proportionate against Houthi military targets, including Hodeidah port, which Israel claimed was used by the Houthis as the main supply route for the transfer of Iranian weapons from Iran to Yemen. The IDF stated the strikes were in response to previous Houthi terror attacks on Israel for the last 9 months, which have numbered more than 200 aerial attacks against Israeli civilians and infrastructure. The IDF further noted that it had operated alone and that this was the first time it struck Yemen. Defense Minister Gallant said in a separate statement that, and I would quote, "The fire that is currently burning in Hodeidah is seen across the Middle East, and the significance is clear," end quote. Meanwhile, the Houthi military personnel characterized the strikes as brutal aggression against Yemen and said the Houthis would respond to this blatant aggression and threaten to strike the vital targets of the Israeli enemy. A preliminary update from the Houthi de facto Ministry of Health indicates 9 deaths, over 80 casualties due to the strikes, as well as considerable damage to civilian infrastructure. There are no verified figures currently available, and it is not clear how many of the reported casualties are civilians. All UN personnel in Hodeidah are safe and accounted for, and there was no damage to UN premises in Hodeidah. You'll hear shortly from General Beery, head of the United Nations mission to support the Hodeidah Agreement. Minor displacements have also been reported from neighborhoods near the Hodeidah port. The extent of damage to the port remains unclear, and fires are still burning. However, local authorities have advised that the port is functioning at a limited capacity. Hodeidah port is a lifeline for millions of people in Yemen. Yemen relies heavily on imports of essential items such as food, medicine, and fuel, with the majority of these goods arriving through Hodeidah. It's essential for the port to be open and operating. Moreover, Hodeidah port is in a densely populated urban center where thousands of people live. Any military campaign in its vicinity risks having devastating consequences for civilians. the Secretary General urged once again on 20 July for all concerned to avoid attacks that could harm civilians and damage civilian infrastructure. He remains deeply concerned about the risk of further escalation in the region and continues to urge all to exercise utmost restraint. On 21 July, the IDF stated on social media that its aerial defense arrays successfully intercepted a surface-to-surface missile that approached Israeli territory from Yemen using the Arrow 3 aerial defense system. The projectile did not cross into Israeli territory. Mr. President, we've also witnessed a deeply worrying continuation of exchanges of fire across the blue line, which, as we have stressed repeatedly, risks further regional conflagration. On 20 July, the Israeli Defense Forces said that 40 rockets, as well as drones, were fired across the blue line, injuring 2 soldiers and igniting fires. Unconfirmed media reports in Lebanon said that the Israeli Defense Forces struck a Hezbollah munitions depot and a vehicle with possible injuries and damage to civilian infrastructure. In addition, this morning, this council heard from the Special Envoy for Syria of the profound risk of regional escalation. Last week, Israel carried out strikes that the Syrian government said hit military sites in southern Syria and a residential area in Damascus. Israel said this was in response to the launch of 2 drones from Syria. Further strikes attributed to Israel over the past month were reported in Tartus, Damascus, rural Damascus, and near the Lebanese border. Mr. President, in Yemen, the fragile gains resulting from the 2022 UN-brokered truce are being eclipsed by violent escalation in the region. The Houthis continue to launch attacks against commercial vehicles in the Red Sea in contravention of Security Council resolutions 2722 and 2739. Verified incidents are reflected in the written reports of the Secretary General, which are based on information received from the International Maritime Organization. As of today, the IMO has verified 42 Houthi attacks. The Houthis have also claimed several joint military operations with the so-called Islamic resistance in Iraq, purportedly in support of the people in the Gaza Strip. The Islamic resistance group is also believed to have launched a drone attack against a base in Iraq hosting personnel of the international coalition to fight ISIS, the first such attack since February. At the same time, Israeli military operations have intensified across Gaza in recent weeks, resulting in further civilian casualties, displacement, and destruction of civilian infrastructure. Palestinian armed groups in Gaza continue to launch rockets indiscriminately towards Israeli population centers. Mr. President, the latest developments show the real danger of a devastating region-wide escalation. As the Secretary General said on 21 June, the risk for the conflict in the Middle East to widen is real and must be avoided. One rash move, one miscalculation could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the borders and, frankly, beyond imagination. On Gaza, the Secretary General has been very clear. We need an immediate and sustainable ceasefire and an unconditional release of hostages. And we need all parties to recommit to a political horizon towards the 2-state solution. On the blue line, I echo the Secretary General in calling on the parties to urgently recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and immediately return to a cessation of hostilities. Furthermore, allow me to reiterate the Secretary General's remarks that attacks against international shipping in the Red Sea area are not acceptable, as they endanger the safety and security of global supply chains and have a negative impact on the economic and humanitarian situation worldwide. And finally, Mr. President, allow me to close with a few words on the issue of detained personnel in Yemen. We remain profoundly concerned about the well-being of Yemeni personnel from the United Nations, national and international non-governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, and civil society that are arbitrarily detained by the Houthi de facto authorities. We urge the de facto authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all of them. And we further request that they are treated with full respect for their human rights, and that they are afforded the ability to contact their families and legal representatives. The Secretary General and other senior UN officials continue to work through all possible channels to secure the immediate and unconditional release of those arbitrarily detained. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю госпожу Ди Карло за ее брифинг и сейчас предоставляю слово генерал-майору Майклу Берри.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief you on the latest events in Hudaydah. Excellencies, I am briefing you today from Hudaydah City, where UNMA, the UN mission to support the Hudaydah Agreement, has its headquarters. Allow me to briefly recall the mission responsibilities before turning to the latest events. Under the framework of the 2018 Stockholm Agreement, and as mandated by this Council, most recently by Resolution 2742, UNMA supports the Yemeni parties in implementing their commitments under the agreement, including the government-wide ceasefire in Hudaydah. As part of its monitoring responsibilities, UNMA regularly patrols the ports of Hudaydah, Salaf and Ras Isa, with a view to preserving the civilian nature of the ports, while over 70% of imports into Yemen come through these ports. Turning now to the latest events, on the 20th of July, at approximately 18:05 local time, UNMA registered loud explosions lasting over 10 minutes. It was subsequently reported that multiple airstrikes targeted Hudaydah's port's fuel storage and port cranes 2 kilometres north of our UNMA headquarters. Also, Ras Khatib Power Station, 20 kilometres from the headquarters, and Al Khatib's military police offices, 12 kilometres northwest of UNMA headquarters. Soon thereafter, Israeli officials publicly confirmed carrying out airstrikes in Hudaydah, as you have heard from Under Secretary General Di Carlo. The fire and thick smoke from the explosions at Hudaydah's port fuel storage are still ongoing and visible from UNMA's compound. Today, on the 22nd of July, as part of the regular patrol schedule, UNMA conducted a monitoring patrol to Hudaydah port and observed the impact of the airstrikes, including damaged fuel storage, damaged cranes, some ongoing firefighting activities, and 4 vessels docked or berthed in the port, including a World Food vessel carrying foodstuff, the Neptune J, which fortunately sustained only minor damage from a falling crane. As I reported before to this Council, the mission operates in a restrictive and highly challenging environment, with each movement subjected to authorization by the de facto authorities, including the patrol to Hudaydah port today. This Council will appreciate the constraints that limit UNMA's full and unfettered access to the ports. Mr. President, I wish to echo the Secretary General's expression of deep concern about the risk of further escalation in the region. I join his call on all concerned to avoid attacks that could harm civilians and damage civilian infrastructure, and I urge all to exercise the utmost constraint. For our part, UNMA will continue to operate in line with its Security Council mandate, which includes regular patrols to the ports of Hudaydah, Ras Isa and As-Salaf, and support de-escalation efforts in Hudaydah, which will contribute to promoting peace across Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю генерала Берри за его брифинг. Сейчас предоставляю слово членам Совета, желающим выступить с заявлением. И я предоставляю слово представителю Соединенных Штатов.
Thank you. Thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Major General Beery, for briefing us today. Colleagues, we join other council members in condemning the Houthis' recent attacks on Israel, which killed one individual and injured several more. These actions unequivocally demonstrate the growing threat to international peace and security posed by the Houthis and their backers in Tehran. And these are not isolated incidents. In recent months, the Houthis have launched approximately 200 missiles and drones toward Israel with no apparent regard for civilian lives. Colleagues, if this does not meet the textbook definition of a threat to international peace and security, I don't know what does. Nonetheless, some members of this council have attempted to advance a false narrative that the Houthis are simply acting in solidarity with the people of Gaza through attacks such as these, as well as their campaign of destructive attacks against commercial and merchant vessels in and around the Red Sea. The reality, colleagues, is straightforward. The Houthis are terrorists, desperate to distract from their own record of catastrophic failures in Yemen. And so, the time has passed for making excuses for the Houthis. The only appropriate response is to condemn these attacks and demand that they stop, immediately and without conditions. Additionally, the United States supports Israel's right to self-defense in the face of these unprecedented attacks and rejects any efforts by members of this council to protest that right. In view of the Houthis' continued attacks and rejection of this council's resolutions, we also believe it may soon be time for this council to consider additional actions to respond to the growing threats from the Houthis. Equally crucial is addressing Iran's role in these and other attacks and holding Iran to account. We can all see plainly and clearly that the Houthis are fully enabled by Iran to launch long-range and deadly attacks on Israel and other countries in the region. Indeed, initial assessments indicate the drone used in the July 19 attack on Tel Aviv was an Iranian-made Samad-3 UAV. There is no disputing that Iran's provision of these and other lethal weapons to Houthi terrorists violates this Council's resolutions, including, most notably, the arms embargo established by Resolution 2216. This Council can no longer ignore that fact and must also respond to Tehran for its flagrant violations of its resolutions and arming of terrorist groups. And let me be clear, any Council member that stands in that way of holding the Houthis and Iran accountable is complicit in undermining the credibility of this Council's resolutions. Colleagues, even as we call on this Council to hold the Houthis and their Iranian backers to account, we remain concerned for the well-being of the Yemeni people. The fires in the port of Hodeidah and the impacts that destruction of oil refineries and power generation may have on the Yemeni people, potentially impacting the flow of humanitarian assistance and commercial imports, are but the latest example of how Yemenis are paying a price for Houthi and Iranian actions. As we will discuss in greater detail during Tuesday's Council meeting, the Yemeni people are suffering principally because of Houthi recklessness and disregard for average Yemenis. At this dangerous moment, it is imperative that we all work to reduce tensions. The best way to do that is by ensuring that this Council speaks with one voice to condemn the Houthis' actions and hold them accountable. The United States remains committed to protecting civilians, resolving the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and seeking a path towards peace for the Yemeni people. Thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Соединенных Штатов за его заявление и предоставляю слово Франции.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Mme DiCarlo et le général Berry pour leurs interventions. Notre Conseil se réunit en urgence après l'attaque de drones qui a ciblé Tel Aviv dans la nuit du 18 au 19 juillet. La France condamne fermement cette attaque revendiquée par les Houthis. Elle réaffirme son attachement à la stabilité régionale et à la sécurité d'Israël. Elle adresse ses condoléances aux proches de la victime et ses pensées aux blessés. Les Houthis, soutenus par l'Iran, doivent immédiatement cesser leurs attaques. Ils doivent au contraire s'engager de bonne foi dans le processus de paix conduit par l'envoyé spécial du secrétaire général. La France demande à l'Iran, qui finance et arme les Houthis, de cesser ses actions déstabilisatrices. Elle déplore que les Houthis poursuivent leurs actions de déstabilisation en mer Rouge. Par sa résolution 2722, notre Conseil a rappelé que les États avaient le droit de défendre leurs navires contre ces attaques. Il a demandé aux Houthis d'y mettre un terme et de libérer immédiatement le Galaxy Leader et son équipage. Ce n'est toujours pas le cas. Notre Conseil doit continuer de l'exiger. La France poursuivra son engagement dans le cadre de l'opération européenne Aspides, défensive et non escalatoire, pour garantir la sécurité maritime et la liberté de navigation. Cette escalade risque de déboucher sur un embrasement régional. Face à la montée des tensions, la France est mobilisée en faveur d'une désescalade rapide en lien avec ses partenaires. Elle exprime sa profonde inquiétude quant à la poursuite des affrontements le long de la ligne bleue entre Israël et le Liban. Nous appelons toutes les parties à la plus grande retenue afin de prévenir un conflit catastrophique. La France poursuit ses efforts dans la recherche d'une solution diplomatique au Liban en se fondant sur la résolution 1701. Elle rappelle son plein soutien à la finule. Monsieur le Président, la France souligne l'urgence d'instaurer enfin un cessez-le-feu dans la bande de Gaza pour mettre un terme aux souffrances de la population et pour permettre l'acheminement de l'aide. Elle exige à nouveau que tous les otages soient libérés sans délai et sans condition. Elle renouvelle son soutien au plan de cessez-le-feu proposé par les États-Unis et aux efforts de médiation de l'Égypte et du Qatar. Elle rappelle la nécessité de respecter le droit international humanitaire. Celui-ci s'impose à tous, y compris à Israël. La France réaffirme l'urgence de mettre en œuvre la solution des deux États. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю Францию за их заявление и предоставляю слово Соединенному Королевству.
Thank you, President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Major General Beery for their briefings. The UK is deeply alarmed by the Houthi attack on Tel Aviv, which saw an Israeli civilian killed in his home and 10 other civilians wounded. My Foreign Secretary condemned this reckless escalation in his statement to the UK Parliament last week. We call for urgent de-escalation. Since October 7th, the Houthis have launched UAVs and missiles towards Israel in dangerous and illegal attacks. These actions risk a further deterioration in the stability and security of the region, and we call upon the Security Council to condemn the Houthi attacks against Israel, in addition to their wider destabilising activity in the Red Sea. This includes launching over 305 attacks against international shipping, impacting over 100 ships and killing innocent crew. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of the Galaxy Leader and its crew, illegally detained by the Houthis since November 2023. In addition, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that Houthi actions, enabled by support from Iran, are part of a wider Iranian strategy to destabilise the region with its malign influence and use of proxies. We call upon Iran to cease its nefarious support to armed groups and terrorist organisations in the Middle East, which only serve to increase the suffering of ordinary people. Finally, while we can confirm that there was no UK involvement in the Israeli strikes against the Houthis on the 20th of July, the UK remains resolute in its support to Israel's right to self-defence, in line with international law and international humanitarian law. The Houthis seek to use the situation in Gaza as justification for their reckless behaviour. Let me be clear. There is no justification for these attacks, and, more broadly, there can be no military solution to the conflict in the Middle East. Yemenis are once again paying the price for the destructive actions of the Houthis, and further escalation will only worsen an already dire humanitarian situation. A diplomatic solution to the region is the only way forward. We strongly support the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar and the US to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, get the hostages out and humanitarian aid in. The deal, as endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735, is the best chance to secure lasting peace. Innocent Palestinians continue to face unfathomable human suffering in Gaza, with a devastating impact on women and children. At least 120 hostages remain in horrific conditions. We urge both sides to show flexibility in negotiations and to recommit themselves to a renewed peace process resulting in a two-state solution. President, I reiterate the UK's call for de-escalation and for meaningful progress to bring about lasting peace and security for the region. I thank you.
Я благодарю Соединенное Королевство за их заявление и предоставляю слово Эквадору.
Gracias, señor presidente. Quiero agradecer a la subsecretaria Di Carlo y al general Berry por sus intervenciones. Reconozco la participación del representante de Israel en esta reunión. Quiero ser claro. El Ecuador condena de la manera más enérgica el ataque perpetrado con drones en Tel Aviv el viernes pasado, reivindicado por los hutíes, y exige el cese inmediato de nuevos ataques. Además, expresamos nuestra solidaridad con las familias de las víctimas. Este no es el primer ataque de los hutíes en contra de Israel y su población, pero sí el primero que ocasiona víctimas civiles. El derecho internacional humanitario prohíbe estrictamente el bombardeo indiscriminado de poblaciones civiles, sin excepción. Los ataques en contra de Israel contravienen el derecho internacional y no tienen justificación alguna, como no la tienen las acciones de los hutíes que continúan recurriendo a la violencia en contra de embarcaciones comerciales en el Mar Rojo. Esta nueva escalada de las hostilidades en la región, provocada por los hutíes, puede comprometer la paz y seguridad internacionales, por lo que mi país subraya la urgencia de detener el ciclo de violencia y se une al llamado del secretario general y de la comunidad internacional para que todos los actores ejerzan la máxima moderación y reduzcan las tensiones. También que enmarquen sus acciones en el derecho internacional y el derecho internacional humanitario, en observancia de los criterios de necesidad, distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución, pues en todo momento es imperativo proteger la vida de los civiles y resguardar las infraestructuras críticas. Muchas gracias.
Я благодарю Эквадор за их заявление и предоставляю слово Гаяне.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Di Carlo and Major General Berry for their briefings and recognize the presence of the representative of Israel in today's meeting. Guyana is deeply concerned about the recent escalation of tensions in the Middle East. The Council must exert all efforts to avoid a wider regional conflagration. We share the USG's concern about the recent airstrikes between the Houthis in Yemen and Israel, which claimed the lives of several persons. Guyana strongly condemns the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure and calls on the parties to desist from such attacks. We also echo USG's call for the unconditional release of all UN and other humanitarian personnel detained in Yemen. The people in Yemen deserve to live in peace. We urge the Houthis to put the interests of the Yemeni people first and give full attention to the negotiations on the political roadmap. Mr. President, the worrying developments over the past few days, coupled with the ongoing attacks in the Red Sea, are not occurring in a vacuum and risk further escalation that could envelop the entire Middle East region. While we condemn these attacks, we must also stress their direct connection with the ongoing war in Gaza, where impunity continues, and further stress that international law must be respected by all parties. We therefore stress again the need to achieve an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and call for this war to end so that Palestinians could start rebuilding their lives. The war has already claimed the lives of nearly 40,000 people, mostly women and children, and maimed over 80,000. This Council must also redouble its efforts to address the root causes of this war. The only viable option remains the full implementation of the two-state solution, with the creation of a free and independent state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders, living peacefully alongside the state of Israel. This is the only path to sustainable peace. In closing, Mr. President, we urge those who claim to sympathize with the Palestinian cause to support ongoing efforts to end the war and to refrain from taking any further action that could derail the peace negotiations or expand the conflict. I thank you.
Я благодарю Гаяну за их заявление и предоставляю слово Японии.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and Major General Berry for their briefings. I must begin by expressing Japan's strong condemnation of the drone attacks by the Houthis on Tel Aviv last Friday, which killed one Israeli civilian and wounded several others. We take note of Israel's announcement that its airstrikes in and around the Hodeidah port the following day are a response to the Houthis' attack on Tel Aviv, as well as to numerous previous Houthis' attacks against Israel over the past month. The fact that the Houthis launched yet another ballistic missile on Sunday and indicated that they would take further actions is deeply worrying, as it will lead to a vicious circle of retaliation. Japan is seriously concerned about the current situation and calls for no further escalation. It has been more than 9 months since the horrifying acts of terror committed by Hamas and other militant groups against Israel, followed by the ongoing hostilities in Gaza. Japan stresses the need for de-escalation, and the Houthis must immediately stop their threats and hostile rhetoric against Israel, which are further destabilizing the Middle East. The Houthis must also immediately cease their reckless attacks on international shipping and unconditionally release the Galaxy Reader and its crew, consistent with this Council's resolution 2722 and 2739. Let us furthermore take this opportunity to demand once again that the Houthis immediately and unconditionally release the personnel from the UN, diplomatic missions, and NGOs that they have arbitrarily detained. Moreover, Japan would like to reiterate that all member states must adhere to their obligations regarding the targeted arms embargo in Resolution 2216. We stand ready to work with fellow Council members and other regional stakeholders to restore peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
Я благодарю Японию за их заявление и предоставляю слово Китаю.
谢谢主席，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长和比利尔团长的通报。本次紧张事态表明加沙冲突外溢影响加速显现，中方对此深表忧虑。军事手段不是解决问题的出路，以暴易暴只会使冲突陷入螺旋升级的恶性循环，使本已十分艰难的局势进一步复杂化。我们呼吁有关各方保持冷静克制，避免紧张局势进一步升级甚至失控。一段时间以来，中东地区局势持续恶化，矛盾冲突不断扩大，根本原因是加沙停火止战一直无法得到落实。为避免一场可能吞噬整个中东的更大浩劫，我们呼吁所有各方顺应国际社会压倒性共识，共同推动立即停火，拯救生命， 缓解灾难，遏制冲突外溢。中方敦促以色列全面落实安理会有关决议，立即停止在加沙的一切军事行动，立即停止对加沙民众的集体惩罚。有重要影响的国家应该加大对当事方的说服和施压力度，切实为平息加沙战火做出真诚努力。主席，中东问题高度复杂敏感，核心是巴勒斯坦问题，根本出路是全面落实两国方案。我们对以色列不断侵蚀两国方案的基础表示担忧。近日，国际法院发表咨询意见，认定以色列持续占领巴勒斯坦违反国际法，以色列有义务立即结束对巴勒斯坦领土的非法占领。中方支持巴勒斯坦早日独立建国，呼吁重振两国方案的政治前景，倡议召开更大规模、更具权威、更有实效的国际和会，制定落实两国方案的时间表和路线图。我们期待国际社会以法院咨询意见为指导，为促进巴勒斯坦问题的早日解决，实现中东地区持久和平稳定不懈努力。谢谢主席。
Я благодарю Китай за их заявление и предоставляю слово Словении.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank USG DiCarlo and Major General Berry for their briefings. Mr. President, once again, we have to begin by expressing our concern over the latest developments in the Middle East. Let me make 3 points in this regard. Firstly, we condemn the drone attack on Tel Aviv, which has been claimed by the Houthis, and deplore subsequent Israeli retaliatory actions on target in Yemen. We call on all parties to respect international law, including international humanitarian law. We recall that under international law, indiscriminate attacks on civilian population centers are prohibited. Secondly, tensions need to be reduced now. In this regard, we call on parties to de-escalate and refrain from any further retaliatory actions. We also call on states with influence to use it to facilitate the utmost restraint from all actors and to prevent any further deterioration on the ground. Thirdly, we would like to express our deep concern over the numerous escalations fueling regional tensions. The devastating situation in Gaza has caused unprecedented civilian suffering. Any military escalation in Yemen is also a serious cause for concern. We are also deeply worried about the alarming tensions along the Blue Line, as well as continuous attacks in the Red Sea. We caution that any miscalculation could lead to unimaginable consequences across the region, particularly for civilians. Mr. President, every provocation and escalation further aggravates the situation in the Middle East. Day after day, we are witnessing what seems to be a never-ending human suffering, women, children, fathers, families, friends being killed. And day after day, the question comes, how is this possible? How is this human? Peace must always come first. It must always have a chance. Therefore, instead of deepening this spiral of violence and intertwining crisis, we call on all actors to engage in the path of dialogue and diplomacy. We also underline the need for the Security Council unity in an effort to uphold international law and to maintain peace and security. I thank you.
Я благодарю Словению за их заявление и предоставляю слово Мозамбику.
Mr. President, we thank the Russian presidency for convening this urgent meeting on the situation in the Middle East. We also thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Major General Michael Berry for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, on July the 19th, the Houthi armed group carried out an airstrike against Israel, resulting in a deadly UAV strike-on. This attack on Tel Aviv tragically claimed the life of one civilian and caused injuries on several others. In response, on the 20th July, Israel Armed Forces launched airstrikes in Yemen on military targets in the Houthi-controlled Hodeidah port area of Yemen, reportedly resulting in at least 9 fatalities. We express our deep concern that these events have the potential to exacerbate tensions between Israel and its neighbors, particularly in the context of the ongoing conflict in Gaza, Palestine. Such actions risk aggravating regional instability and could trigger further conflicts, with far-reaching negative impacts on regional and international peace and security. We condemn the Houthi attacks on Israel and the subsequent Israel airstrike in Yemen. We firmly believe that such actions further escalate the conflict in the Middle East and hinder progress towards regional stability. We call on both parties to exercise maximum restraint to avoid further loss of life and destruction. These attacks and counterattacks can only deepen the conflict and undermine ongoing efforts to halt the war in Gaza and promote peace. Mr. President, this Council has repeatedly warned of the risk of the Israel-Palestine conflict spreading across the region and about its consequences. We reiterate our call for the international community to redouble efforts to avoid the escalation of the conflict across the entire region. These recent events underscore the urgent need to address the Palestinian question as part of broader efforts to achieve lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. We call for the immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Palestinian conflict in compliance with Security Council resolutions for the greater sake of regional stability. The reported casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in Hodeidah are deeply concerning. The port of Hodeidah, as a critical point for humanitarian aid delivery, must remain accessible to support the needs of the Yemeni people. We underscore the necessity of ensuring humanitarian access to all affected areas. Mozambique calls for an immediate de-escalation of hostilities and encourage all parties to engage in a constructive dialogue to resolve their differences peacefully. International efforts should focus on facilitating negotiations and finding a lasting resolution to the conflict. We reiterate our consistent appeal to Council members to intensify efforts towards a sustainable solution to the Middle East conflict, and with the primary focus on the Israel-Palestine. In this context, we reaffirm the critical importance for the implementation of a two-state solution, the establishment of two independent and sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, both as full members of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю Мозамбик за их заявление и предоставляю слово Республике Корея.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to USGT Carlo and Major General Berry, the head of UNMA, for their informative updates. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Israel. First and foremost, the Republic of Korea condemns in the strongest terms the Houthi drone attack on Tel Aviv, which killed an innocent civilian and caused several injuries. This reckless behavior is deeply concerning, especially given the ongoing Houthi attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, which pose significant challenges not only to regional security but to global commerce as well. As such, we echo the Secretary General's apprehension that such dangerous acts can further inflame escalation in the region. Mr. President, we also take note of Israel's airstrikes on the Hodeidah port in response to the Houthi attack, which reportedly caused dozens of civilian casualties. In this regard, we urge all parties to heed the words of the Secretary General to refrain from any actions that endanger civilian lives or damage civilian infrastructure. We also emphasize the great importance of keeping the Hodeida port both operational and stable, as it serves as the key gateway for the majority of commercial and humanitarian goods entering Yemen, thereby mitigating further hardships of the long-suffering Yemeni people. It is dismaying that the Houthis persist in choosing the wrong path by continuing attacks on commercial ships and holding hostages, including UN, international and national NGOs, and diplomatic personnel. These unlawful actions are simply unacceptable, cannot be justified for any reason. Mr. President, this recent deadly Houthi attack on Tel Aviv using a so-called new type of UAV that flew over 2,000 kilometers illustrates the need for a more effective implementation of UN sanctions. In particular, the arms embargo established by Security Council Resolution 2216. As the chair of the Yemen Sanctions Committee, we are alarmed that the 2023 final report by the panel of experts highlighted large-scale violations involving advanced weapons, such as ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, and UAVs. In this connection, it is believed that there has been an unprecedented scale of both maritime and land-based arms embargo violations as of late. We reiterate our call for all UN member states, including neighboring countries, to faithfully implement the targeted arms embargo. We also hope that all Council members will engage in constructive discussions based on the panel's findings and recommendations to ensure that Security Council decisions are carried out. These efforts should include establishing ways to patch a loophole in the sanctions regime and enhance the capacity of the government of Yemen to enforce the arms embargo. Furthermore, we underline the UN UNTV's crucial role in ensuring compliance with the arms embargo and facilitating the delivery of commercial and humanitarian goods to northern Yemen. In this regard, we express serious concern over the recent increase in vessels entering the Hodeida port, unexpected by UNTV. Mr. President, alongside nearly 10 months of Gaza conflict, heightened exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah across the Blue Line, and other dangerous conflicts in the region, any additional escalation or miscalculation could push the already precarious regional security landscape even further towards the abyss. As such, we appeal to all parties involved, both state and non-state actors, to exercise the utmost restraint in the critical days and weeks ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю Республику Корея за их заявление и предоставляю слово Алжиру.
Mr. President, I thank Madame Di Carlo and Major General Berry for their briefings. From the beginning of the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people, Algeria, along with others, has warned of the risk of destabilizing the whole region. We also emphasized this during negotiation of Resolution 2722 and 2739 on maritime security in the Red Sea. Algeria expressed its deep concern regarding the Israeli ongoing military operations and airstrikes targeting various sites in Hodeida Governorate. Every day we count more and more victims among civilians, children, and women. The toll of human suffering is compounded by the regrettable destruction of critical infrastructure. The use of force will only complicate the situation and risk undermining the Special Envoy for Yemen's effort to launch the political process. We urge all parties to exercise restraint at this critical juncture to avoid further escalation. The situation demands immediate attention and diligent action to address the root causes of the conflict in the region. Today, we were not of regional spillover because we are already facing a regional conflict. We warn of further escalation. The need for a ceasefire in Gaza has never been more urgent. A ceasefire in Gaza remains the key to stability in the Middle East. The Palestinian people face a daily humanitarian catastrophe under cruel occupation. The dire situation requires special attention by the Security Council. There is an urgent need to call for a meeting to debate the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Algeria believes the immediate priority is to halt the genocide in Gaza and ultimately end the occupation of Arab lands. We must impose peace now. This is the only path to peace and stability in the Middle East. I thank you.
Я благодарю Алжир за их заявление и предоставляю слово Швейцарии.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe, Madame Di Carlo, et le général Beery, chef de l'UNMA, pour leurs interventions. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par les développements de ces derniers jours. Nous condamnons l'attaque de drones revendiquée par les Houthis contre Tel Aviv ce vendredi 19 juillet. Une personne a trouvé la mort suite à cette attaque, tandis qu'une dizaine d'autres ont été blessés. Nous déplorons la frappe par Hodeïda menée par l'armée israélienne en réponse à cette attaque. Ceci a causé la mort de plusieurs personnes, blessé près de 80 autres et causé des dommages considérables à des infrastructures civiles. L'impact humanitaire de ces frappes est considérable. Le port de Hodeïda reste un point de passage essentiel pour l'acheminement du pétrole et de l'énergie pour le pays, ainsi que de la nourriture et des médicaments pour ceux qui en ont besoin. Nous rappelons que toute opération militaire doit respecter le droit international, dont la Charte des Nations Unies et le droit international humanitaire. En outre, nous adressons nos condoléances aux proches de toutes les victimes en Israël comme au Yémen. Chaque attaque dans la région, y compris les derniers tirs de missiles contre Eilat, nous rapproche d'une escalade régionale encore plus grave, un risque que nous avons la responsabilité de mitiger. À ce titre, nous réitérons notre appel fait lors de la première réunion du Conseil de cette année sur la situation en mer Rouge. Ce Conseil doit rester uni et accomplir son mandat en conformité avec le droit international. Tous les acteurs dans la région doivent faire preuve de prudence et de la plus grande retenue, en tout temps respecter le droit international, y compris la Charte des Nations Unies et le droit international humanitaire. Ces frappes s'inscrivent dans un contexte particulièrement tendu. La situation au Proche-Orient et ses répercussions régionales, y compris en mer Rouge, présentent le risque d'une escalade au Yémen et dans la région. La situation à Gaza et dans le reste du territoire palestinien occupé, ainsi que la montée des tensions le long de la ligne bleue, restent alarmantes. Seules des solutions politiques sont à même d'amener la paix et la sécurité dans l'ensemble de la région. Un cessez-le-feu à Gaza, ainsi que la cessation des attaques par les groupes armés dans la région, sont urgentes. Les résolutions du Conseil de sécurité doivent être mises en œuvre immédiatement. Cela vaut aussi pour le Yémen. Les mesures prises par ce Conseil en vue de favoriser une résolution par le dialogue du conflit au Yémen, en particulier l'embargo sur les armes établi par la résolution 2216, doivent être strictement respectées. Monsieur le Président, les événements de ces derniers jours nous préoccupent profondément. Le respect du droit international, le dialogue entre les parties au conflit et la désescalade doivent être nos priorités. La Suisse soutient les efforts des Nations Unies à cet effet. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю Швейцарию за их заявление и предоставляю слово Мальте.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Under-Secretary General De Carlo and Major General Beery for their briefings. The war in Gaza is having a devastating impact in the Middle East, and the risk of it turning into a wider conflict is greater than ever before. This Council must focus on prioritizing de-escalation and restraint as a pathway out of this bleak and extremely volatile period. There is no more time to lose. We must act in a decisive manner to ensure the full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712, 2720 and 2735. Most importantly, Hamas and Israel must accept and implement the ceasefire proposal outlined in 2735. Recent developments illustrate this in the clearest way possible. We condemn the Houthi-claimed drone attack on Tel Aviv on 19 July, We call on the Houthis to immediately cease all attacks in the region. The indiscriminate shelling of civilian population centers is prohibited under international law, and this is binding on all actors. Furthermore, we call on the Houthis to cease their actions against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. These attacks disrupt mediation efforts and hamper progress towards a political solution to the conflict in Yemen. The retaliatory airstrikes by Israel in and around the port of Hodeidah left many victims and casualties while causing considerable damage to civilian infrastructure. This is concerning. We must again underscore that all parties are obliged to protect civilians under international law. President, we call on all member states in the region and those with influence over the parties to facilitate and encourage the escalation towards a peaceful solution. We emphasize that all member states must strictly abide by Security Council resolutions, including full compliance with the UN arms embargo. In conclusion, President, we reiterate our call on all parties to exercise restraint, to de-escalate and pursue peaceful solutions to all disputes. This is the only way forward. There is no alternative route if we are to prevent the flames of war from engulfing the entire region. I thank you.
Я благодарю Мальту за их заявление и предоставляю слово Сьерра-Леоне.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting at the request of United States, United Kingdom, and France. We also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and Major General Michael Berry for their valuable information provided. At the outset, Sierra Leone notes with serious concern the information contained in the identical letter from the Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, dated 19th July 2024, on the launching of a Samad 3-way UAV by the Houthis from Yemen, which hit a civilian target in Tel Aviv and led to the death of an Israeli civilian and injured about 10 persons. Sierra Leone, in the strongest terms, condemns this act, which violates the UN Charter and the fundamental principle of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states. We further note the report of Israeli retaliatory strike on the Hodeidah port in Yemen with reported casualties. We note with concern that this action may lead to an escalation in the cycle of violent attacks between the parties and an exacerbation of tensions in the already volatile region with dire security and humanitarian consequences for civilians. As the Middle East grapples with an extended conflict in the Gaza Strip, we reject further attacks that may gravely impact civilians and threaten global peace and security. We are deeply concerned that heightened tension may jeopardize the already delicate negotiations between Israel and Hamas. For this reason and many more, Sierra Leone urges the Houthis and other armed groups to desist from capitalizing on the fragility of the region to perpetuate their wrongful and escalatory actions. We remain particularly concerned with the Houthis' activities in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, targeting commercial and military vessels, all of which undermine freedom of navigation in the international waters and risk wider regional confrontation. Given the recurring nature of the attacks and conflicts in the Middle East over the past 9 months, including in the Gaza Strip, across the Blue Line in Lebanon, the Red Sea and elsewhere, it is imperative for the de-escalation of tensions to be the utmost priority of the conflicting parties. On the basis of the dangerous escalation, Sierra Leone would like to convey the following. Firstly, we call on the Houthis to respect and implement all resolutions of the Security Council, including resolutions 2216, that demands inter alia that the Houthis refrain from any provocation or threats to neighboring states, and 2722, that demands that the Houthis immediately cease all attacks which undermine navigational rights and freedom, as well as regional peace and security. Secondly, we stress the need for parties to the conflict to exercise restraint and avoid further escalation, and we demand their utmost respect for applicable international law. We call on them to prioritize the protection of civilians in line with international humanitarian law, noting that they bear the brunt of the conflict. Damage of the Hodeida port, which is vital for the importation of humanitarian supplies, such as food, medicine, and fuel into Yemen, will have catastrophic implications for the suffering civilian population of Yemen. Mr. President, the reported and claimed acts of the Houthis are a violation of international law and the UN Charter. They cannot be justified. With the above noted, Sierra Leone takes note that the unresolved Palestine question is a major obstacle to peace and stability in the Middle East. Accordingly, it is worth repeating the need for parties to the conflict to respect the clear demands of the Security Council and to fully implement resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Resolution 2735 was adopted to ensure a deal is agreed, one that could constitute a major step forward in achieving a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and improve humanitarian coordination and safety for the mutual benefit of both parties. In this regard, Sierra Leone welcomes the clarity and moral authority that has been provided by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19th July 2024 on legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. As we continue to study the advisory opinion and its implications for the parties, the State of Palestine, and the occupying power, the State of Israel, the erga omnes obligation of third parties and international organizations, including the United Nations, it is now clear that the two-state solution is the only path to be pursued. This can be kickstarted with a permanent ceasefire to be agreed by Israel and Hamas in Gaza, as the UN General Assembly and this Security Council work out the modalities to implement the finding of the ICJ that Israel's occupation and annexation of Palestinian territories is unlawful, and therefore it should end its occupation of Palestinian territories as soon as possible. The ongoing negotiations must be informed of this authoritative interpretation of existing and binding customary international law by the ICJ. In closing, Mr. President, states with influence and regional actors are once again urged to apply the necessary pressure on the parties to the conflict to implement Security Council resolutions and generally support all efforts towards a comprehensive and inclusive solution that addresses the root causes of the instability in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the wider Middle East region. I thank you.
Я благодарю Сьерра-Леоне за их заявление. Сейчас я сделаю заявление в качестве представителя Российской Федерации. Признательный заместителю генерального секретаря ООН по политическим вопросам и миростроительству госпоже Розмари Ди Карло и главе миссии ООН по поддержке и осуществлению соглашения по Ходейде генералу Майклу Берри за их доклады. Формальным поводом для созыва сегодняшнего заседания Совета Безопасности рядом его западных членов стал нанесенный 19 июля по центру израильского города Тель-Авив удар с помощью БПЛА. В результате него погиб один человек и было ранено еще несколько лиц. Ответственность за нападение взяло йеменское движение Ансар-Алла. Россия, безусловно, осуждает любые атаки на гражданское население и объекты гражданской инфраструктуры. Выражаем соболезнования семье погибшего, желаем пострадавшим скорейшего восстановления. Однако не можем не напомнить нашим коллегам по Совету, настоявшим на проведении данной встречи, что дроны, ракеты и прочие виды вооружений запускаются в сторону Израиля противниками его действий в Газе почти каждый день. Это следует из распространенного Западным Иерусалимом письма в Совет Безопасности в связи с инцидентом. По большей части их удается нейтрализовать, однако 19 июля произошел трагический инцидент. Мы ни в коей мере не принижаем чувствительность данного происшествия для Тель-Авива. Однако при этом менее чем сотни километров к югу от этого города эскалация имеет совсем другие масштабы. Уже без малого 10 месяцев продолжается кровопролитная операция Израиля в секторе Газа, унесшая жизни уже 39 тысяч ни в чем не повинных газовитян. 7 октября, несмотря на однозначную позицию всего международного сообщества и решения международных инстанций, включая Совет Безопасности и Международный суд ООН, Цахал продолжает жестокую зачистку анклава, одного из наиболее густонаселенных районов мира. Только за последние сутки на территории Газы убито 37 палестинцев и ранено 57. Анклав буквально лежит в руинах, уничтожены жилые дома, школы, больницы. От гражданской инфраструктуры практически не осталось камня на камне. В пятницу мы созовем заседание Совета по гуманитарной ситуации в Газе. Число жертв среди гуманитарного персонала ООН и НПО уже приближается к 300. Это самая большая единовременная потеря для ООН в современной истории. И при всем этом Израиль по-прежнему, при очевидном потакании Вашингтона, продолжает игнорировать все принятые в Совете Безопасности резолюции и любые мирные подходы, включая пресловутый план Байдена, существующий только на бумаге. Не могу не спросить тех, кто настоял на нашей встрече сегодня, где вы были неделю назад, когда израильские военно-воздушные силы нанесли сильнейший удар по району Аль-Маваси, близ Хан-Юниса, или позавчера по лагерям беженцев Бурейдж-Нусират, где погибло 13 человек, включая ребенка. Почему же вы не забили тревогу, требуя созвать срочное заседание Совета Безопасности? Эти районы самими израильскими военными были определены как гуманитарная зона, в которой разрешено было укрыться беженцам. Просто посмотрите на цифры. Более 100 погибших, около 300 раненых. Какой же мощности должен был быть этот удар, чтобы привести к таким разрушениям? Сколько дронов, подобных прилетевшему по Тель-Авиву, потребовалось бы для этого? У вас с этим не возникает проблем? Можно в очередной раз лишь поразиться избирательной слепоте и двойным стандартам наших коллег по Совету. Своим потаканием, действиям Израиля вы лишь становитесь соучастниками крайне опасной эскалации, все отчетливее принимающей региональный масштаб. Так, Израиль немедленно отреагировал на попадание хуситского дрона в своем духе, атаковав йеменский порт Ходейда с использованием американских истребителей F-15. В результате авиаударов 3 человека убиты, 87 ранено, разбомблен нефтяной терминал и электростанция недалеко от берега Красного моря. Все это произошло в гражданском порту, где, по сообщениям ООН, уже долгое время не наблюдается никаких военных действий. Через него идет львиная доля коммерческих и, главное, гуманитарных грузов для страны, в которой уже много лет не утихает гуманитарная катастрофа. Можно представить, сколько еще людей косвенно пострадает от новой крайне опасной авантюры Цахал, если вспомнить, что в Йемене более 21 миллиона жителей и 2/3 населения страны по-прежнему нуждаются в том или ином виде гуманитарной помощи и защите. Повторяем, силой не добиться ничего, кроме дальнейшей повсеместной эскалации насилия в регионе. Ведь мотивация руководства Ансар-Алла не является ни для кого секретной. Они прямо увязывают прекращение своих действий с прекращением израильской бойни в Газе. В этом, кстати сказать, требования хуситов, кто бы как бы к ним ни относился, совпадают с требованиями Совета Безопасности ООН. К языку силы же это движение привыкло уже давно. Вот и продолжающиеся уже более полугода бомбардировки территории Йемена, так называемой коалиции во главе США и Великобритании, никакого результата не дали. И хуситы по-прежнему представляют собой существенную военную силу. Стремление Израиля к эскалации хуситов лишь раззадорит, и теперь мы рискуем получить еще один острый конфликт. Коллеги, выход из сложившегося кризиса нам всем предельно ясен. Необходимо немедленное и безусловное прекращение огня в Газе, равно как и освобождение всех удерживаемых в анклаве заложников и произвольно задержанных палестинцев. Об этом регулярно говорим и мы, и большинство наших коллег по Совету, и почти все международное сообщество. Прекратится насилие в Газе, весь регион сможет вздохнуть спокойно. Это касается также и турбулентности в Красном море. Очень хочется верить, что западные члены Совета смогут донести эту нехитрую логику до своих израильских коллег. Я вновь приступаю к исполнению обязанностей председателя Совета, и сейчас я предоставляю слово Израилю.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me firstly to thank the United States, Britain and France for convening the special session, and our briefers here today. Since the beginning of the current war in Gaza, Israel has had to fight to defend itself, not only on one front, but on 7 fronts. Attacks on Israel have been launched by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias from Iraq and Syria, the Houthis from Yemen, and by Iran directly. All these 7 fronts have one thing in common. They were activated by a mastermind in Tehran who financed, trained, and armed its proxies to fight the Jewish state. In the north, we face the terror army of Hezbollah, which has been built up by Iran since 1979 and possesses today more than 150,000 rockets. Hezbollah has launched since October 7th more than 6,500 rockets, 1,100 anti-tank missiles, and more than 250 explosive drones on the people of northern Israel. In the south, we face attacks launched by the Houthis, whose military arsenal grew in the last years thanks to the weapons and training provided by Iran and Hezbollah. Thus, the little brother of Hezbollah tried to overshadow the big brother, and in the last few years has targeted many countries in the Middle East. We still remember its attacks on Abu Dhabi with explosive drones and the thousands of ballistic missiles it shot at Saudi Arabia. In the last few months, the Iranians directed their newest proxy, the Houthis, to increase terror activity and to obstruct the shipping in the Red Sea and launch attacks against Israel. Mr. President, since the beginning of the Gaza war, the Houthis have launched more than 220 ballistic missiles and explosive drones at Israel. Last Friday, as was stated here already in the Council, in the early morning, an explosive drone launched by the Houthis from Yemen hit Tel Aviv, killing a civilian, 50-year-old Yevgeny Farber, and injuring 10 additional Israeli citizens. It hit a building just 100 yards from the US consulate in Tel Aviv. The drone that was used in the attack was a Samad-3 UAV, an Iranian weapon that was upgraded to extend its flight range. The UAV was in the air for over 9 hours and flew over 2,000 kilometers. Please calculate what this range means, dear colleagues, to states and countries in the region and beyond. Think what this means if the Houthis are not stopped now. Israel decided to react in its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. From the beginning of the war, which began after the brutal Hamas attack of October 7th on Israeli civilians, the government made it clear Israel will act against all those who attack us. Israel has no conflict with Yemen or its people. It is clear that the Houthis are acting on behalf of and in the name of radical Iranian ideology. They prove it with their symbols, statements, and actions. The Houthi flag is emblazoned with phrases in Arabic in red: death to America, death to Israel, and curse the Jews. This reflects their priorities and values. They have proved it with attacks on Israel and international shipping. Let me be very clear. The port of Hodeidah is not an innocuous port. Hodeidah is being used for terrorist purposes and therefore is a legitimate military target. The port of Hodeidah receives arms shipments directly from Iran, including the UAV that was fired at Tel Aviv. These are, in fact, pieces of Iranian military equipment that are assembled and used by the Houthis. The Houthis cannot cynically expect immunity for a port supplying their needs as they use it for military purposes. In terms of international shipping, the Houthis have closed the Bab el-Mandab Straits, thereby significantly lengthening global shipping trade routes with their threats and attacks. In recent weeks, they attacked a vessel in the Mediterranean Sea as well. No one in this room is immune from the effects of these attacks. Over 30% of international trade has been affected. Houthi militants have threatened or taken hostage mariners from over 20 different countries. I wish to thank the United States, Britain, France, and other members of the International Maritime Coalition, Prosperity Guardian, that was established to repel the Houthi attacks. I wish to restate and clarify. Houthi terrorism is part of the regional terrorist array operated by Iran, along with other proxies such as Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran is the head of the snake. It arms, trains, and finances the Houthis. The international community must increase the pressure on Iran and impose more crippling sanctions on Tehran. Iran must be stopped as it continues to endanger the stability of the Middle East and the entire world. Israel will continue to protect its citizens against any threat, near and far. The attack by the Houthis, a proxy of Iran, crossed all the red lines, and after more than half a year of restraint in the face of the Houthi attacks, Israel was forced to strike in Yemen. The Houthis are a focal point for destabilizing the region and the international arena. The Houthis have recently started developing their activities in Iraq through cooperation with pro-Iranian Shiite militants. The repeated attacks by the Houthis on Israel and on ships in the Red Sea with weapons supplied to them by Iran constitute a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. This very council imposed sanctions on the Houthis, including travel bans and asset freezes in Resolution 2140 in 2014, and a weapons embargo in Resolution 2216 in 2015. These steps are welcome, but not sufficient, and we can so evidently see. This Council must do more. Israel calls on the Security Council to 1. Increase sanctions against Iran, 2. Improve enforcement of the existing sanctions against the Houthis and its leaders, and take the necessary preventive steps against Houthi targets. Visibly designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization as those who initiated the conflict. The Security Council must issue a harsh condemnation of the Houthis in the upcoming discussions of Yemen at the Security Council. It must condemn the destabilizing activities of the Houthis and support Israel's right to defend its territory and citizens. In defending ourselves against this Iranian terror axis, Israel stands on the front lines against a regime that threatens the entire Middle East and threatens the entire world. That is why all those who seek a more secure and stable Middle East should fully support Israel's actions against this terror axis in Yemen, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. To our enemies, do not doubt Israel's determination to defend itself. I thank you.
Я благодарю Израиль за их заявление. Список ораторов исчерпан. Заседание закрывается.